Today on the Grid Snaps podcast, the Super Nintendo, according to Patrick. And welcome to the Grid Snaps podcast. Rob Howard here with co-host Patrick and second-time guest Jason Gahler. If you remember way back, Jason was on the ECM Memorial podcast. We welcome him back again on this special show that we really just came up with just a few days ago. We were just chatting as we do in our normal day-to-day lives, and we started on this topic of the Super Nintendo, and we started talking about games, and I just decided just to randomly start blasting games at Patrick, and by golly, Patrick had an opinion on a lot of them, and I thought this would be a fun podcast to do. But before we get into that, first of all, I want to say Happy New Year to everyone. 2020, here we go, yay, awesome. And so, Jason, there's one anecdote that, because of the nature of the ECM thing, it wasn't really appropriate to get into stuff like this, so I'll mention it now. You had a really cool experience with Pac-Man some years ago, and I thought it would be cool if you could tell our audience about it.
Yeah, so I was able to participate in the Pac-Man World Championship. It was in 2007 in New York City. 10 participants from around the world competed to see who the world's greatest Pac-Man player was. I actually qualified for this partly because of you, Rob. I think you were the one that sent me the sort of the notice that this was actually going to happen, and you knew that I played Pac-Man a lot. But there was qualifying round on Xbox 360, and then 10 players were flown to New York City to compete, and we competed on the Pac-Man Championship Edition, which was being released. So I ended up placing 4th in the world.
In the world?
Indeed. In the world. I was the highest ranking participant from the United States. Smacked down Billy Mitchell along the way.
Which is, in and of itself, a worthy accomplishment, I do believe.
Indeed, the infamous.
Less infamous then, but still pretty infamous, for sure, right? Like... before the old cheating scandal and all the rest of it. And I know that he's actually, I read a little bit about that he was preparing some kind of defense or whatever. And who knows, right? Who knows if there's a Zapruder film or something. Right.
But I don't pay much attention to all of the drama that's going on with that. He seemed pretty nice to the little bit that I interacted with him. But he certainly has a divisive reputation these days.
What I like about that whole scene, by the way, and there's really, actually, I'll say to everyone listening, I think everyone knows about the King of Kong, that movie. I think low-key, the movie Man vs. Snake is actually a lot better than King of Kong. Only because, like, King of Kong tries so hard to uplift this Steve Wiebe, or however you say his name, versus Billy Mitchell kind of rivalry, and yes, it did exist, and it was all... But I found that the Man vs. Snake story about Timothy McVeigh, no, not that one, not that one, the guy that plays Snake, the high scorer guy, I feel like that was a more heartwarming, compelling story than this sort of mudslinging thing, so... but it's really fascinating that there's this scene of people that just go for these high scores on early to mid 80s arcade games, and it's its own kind of little universe.
You'll definitely recognize a lot of the same people. You get into those era of games. And I did enjoy that movie as well.
Yeah, because actually one of the people prominently featured in Man vs. Snake was in that Pac-Man competition that I didn't realize. The Canadian fellow, right? I believe Dwayne Richard, I think Richards or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, he was there. He ended up, I think, 3rd.
So a respectable showing. He wasn't apparently he didn't need to use a board that was artificially sped up through. Right.
No.
Yeah, right. Well, anyway, really cool. I mean, we could do a whole podcast on that experience, but alas, that is not what this one is about. So we're going to take a quick little break, and when we come back, we're going to ask Patrick about Super Nintendo games. Welcome back to the Grid Snaps podcast. Rob Howard here with Patrick and guest Jason Gahler. So first, before we get into the games, I want to just very briefly, each of us talk about our Super Nintendo experiences. So Jason, your experience with the Super Nintendo, what was it?
Sure. So the 16-bit generation is my favorite generation of games. The Genesis for me is my favorite, but I do still love the Super Nintendo as well. I bought a Sega Genesis with my own hard-earned cash at the young age of 11, 12, or whatever it was.
How do you earn cash? Was it from newspaper delivery or like mowing lawns? Because like 11, 12, you're not working at the local gas station, probably, right? Like,
yeah, I think it was just saving up gift money primarily. There may have been some earning from chores and things like that. Growing up in a rural area, there was opportunities for doing hard labor for people. But yeah, and then not too long after I bought the Genesis, my mom actually won one of those in-store drawings for the Super Nintendo.
That never happens to me, by the way. Like that kind of cool stuff.
Yeah. Oh. So I was fortunate to have both. Definitely enjoyed that era of gaming.
So Patrick, your experience with the Super Nintendo, which I know is your all-time favorite system of any.
Oh, absolutely. And yeah, and I appreciate your deference here to me as an authority on the Super Nintendo. That's well-placed trust. So, kind of similar to Jason, the 16-bit era was my favorite, and I had a Genesis. I received it for Christmas one year because my brother convinced my parents that they should buy that instead of the TurboGrafx, which was excellent advice on his part. So I saved up my own hard-earned money, mainly by skipping school lunches and saving the $1 every day. And I didn't need to eat lunch. I mean, had to get money somehow, right? So anyway, I saved up my hard-earned money, and then I used that to buy a Sega CD because no way was I going to buy a Super Nintendo system. But I played a lot of the games at friends' houses, and years later, just to kind of fill in that portion of my gaming history and knowledge, I did buy a used Super Nintendo, I guess from Funko Land, and just went bonkers and bought as many games as I could get my hands on, which was actually a lot at the time. I mean, I remember going in and buying Hagane for $2, which sells for like $300 now. And so, I mean, like everything was available when I did start purchasing the games and just playing them like a maniac. And and pretty much at every one really admiring how the Genesis was so much better.
By the way, this is the kind of, no pun intended, genesis of this conversation was me basically going, well, Patrick, what about this game? What about that game? Trying to defend the honor of the mighty Super Nintendo. So the research department, by the way, caught wind of your claim that you skipped lunch every day and did this calculation. They've come back and informed me that now, of course, this depends on the school system and exactly how long the school year is and all that. But they're telling me that you would have raised $266 as a maximum estimated amount by skipping lunch every day, and that does seem like you actually could have done that. That actually might have worked had you saved
$1.10 per day.
Yeah. So
that was the cost of lunch.
Now, I don't know. Our research department was put on the spot, so I don't necessarily know if their numbers are accurate, but they crunched the numbers a little bit and came up with that. So as hard as that is to believe, I guess it is possible, and we'll let that slide. We won't Snopes.com you or whatever.
I will let the truth slide. I see how it is.
That's right. So my experience with the Super Nintendo is kind of the canonical experience that you would expect a Nintendo fan to have. I mean, whereas I had the NES, originally, and I was suckered into that amazing advertising campaign with the original Legend of Zelda, where the kid would go, Zelda, whatever. And of course, I got the Legend of Zelda, with the system, the one that had Duck Hunt and Mario Brothers, and I was off and running then. And so eventually, I got a Super Nintendo as well. It wasn't immediate. I think the system had been out a year or two by then, and I remember kind of salivating over all the games. And I was never the sort of person that hated the Genesis. It was just not in my universe, right? I understood it was a thing. I knew it was out there, but it just was inconceivable, sort of like how my Detroit Lions fandom is inconceivable. I can't ever not be a fan of the Detroit Lions. It was just sort of a thing in my life that happened, and it cannot be undone. And sort of that was my feeling about the Nintendo as well, Nintendo consoles. So, I got the console, and I did not do manual labor. I was apparently a spoiled brat kid. Jason and I are at the same age, so that's why I marvel. Either we're the same age or really close. So I kind of marveled at his ability to earn his own money. I didn't do that until the N64. That was the first console I bought with my own money, working jobs and such when I was, a freshman in high school, whatever that was. So anyway, yeah, I mean, I didn't know any better, but I liked it, and I still love it to this day. Certainly, there's a few games we'll talk about in a second that are particular favorites of mine. One thing, though, as I was reflecting on my love of the Super Nintendo, that's a little weird, is that I think this was because where I grew up, it was a very kind of lower income rural area, and there weren't that many other Super Nintendos around, or Genesis, to speak nothing of the Turbo Graphics, or heaven forbid the Neo Geo. I mean, the kind of the non-mainline systems were just nowhere to be found in Putnam County. So I wasn't trading with neighbors. I felt like I played most of the NES library, even though I only actually owned a tiny subset of games just through trades and so on. Whereas with the Super Nintendo, there really wasn't any trading with neighbors, so I missed actually a lot of stuff. I mean, I played certain things that I liked, but there's weird gaps. I actually didn't play Link to the Past until it came out on the Game Boy Advance, when I was in my early 20s. So that's and I consider myself a Zelda fan. I just missed it, just missed the boat on it, right? There's a lot of the RPGs I played well after the fact, even though I played their NES precursors and loved them. I played Final Fantasy on the NES and thought it was amazing, but I just totally missed the Final Fantasy games on the Super Nintendo entirely, and all the kind of related RPGs. I played a lot of Street Fighter on the Super Nintendo. Actraiser was an RPG. I guess you could kind of call it an RPG, even though it's a hybrid, whatever. That's a game I dearly love. It's still one of my all-time favorite games. Of course, Super Mario World I loved. But a lot of big titles I just missed on just because of the different situation. You only get a few games a year and whatever. So... All right, well, let's jump into the games now. So, Patrick, I have a couple of lists, and let me give some credit here. The main list I'm using comes from videogamecritic.com. It's a long-running website. They've been kind of internet friends of mine, gosh, I would think since the late 90s, early 2000s. It's basically run by one guy, and it's mostly his reviews. So he's, just an amazing gamer, a game collector, whatever. So that's the one list I'm using. And then because he's not really an RPG guy, I do have a separate list of RPGs to go from that just comes from some fan-made wiki, just on the internet. Anyone can find it. So let's start. Now, Patrick, here are the rules. Let's remind our panel here of the rules. We're going to ask Patrick about a game. All right. Now, if Patrick does not have an opinion on the game, now I would assume it means you've played it, but maybe you have an opinion anyway. If you have no opinion at all, just say pass, and we'll just move immediately to another game. All right? Do we understand the rules?
I understand the rules. I will try to follow.
All right. And we may have tangents. This is, basically when Patrick makes his statement, then Jason and I may or may not add to it. And if we don't, then we'll go to the next game. Okay, what should be the first game? Let's go with Shaq Fu. Ooh. Shaq Fu by Electronic Arts, 1994.
Shaq Fu?
Yes.
Pass.
Oh, that's disappointing. Okay, next game. Now, this one I know you'll have some opinions on. Space Megaforce, Toho, 1992.
Yes, Space Megaforce, which is part of Compile's famous Aleste series, the same series that like Musha and Robo Aleste were in. So anyway, a lot of people think that Space Megaforce is basically a 10 out of 10 shooter on the Super Nintendo. It's often hailed as a hardcore classic. Those people are completely wrong. The game is terrible. Wow. It's the worst game that Compile ever made. It's slow, as in your movement is just slow on the screen. It has 12 levels, which seem to last an eternity, and what makes it even worse is that those levels, they're just filled with non-interactive nonsense. Like there's one stage where there's a spinning space station which zooms in and out of the distance, and it was really a showcase for Mode 7. And the thing is, while I was doing all this spinning and scaling and zooming and rotating it and all of that, there's nothing on the space station that you can actually hit. Yeah, there are other enemies flying around on the screen, but it's basically just this pixelated space station moving all around in the background, and it takes forever to defeat it. The game also has planets that zoom in and out for no reason, which is one of the dumbest obstacles. It's just constantly you're reminded, oh yeah, this is a Super Nintendo game because it has scaling and rotation, and never are you thinking, oh yeah, this is actually really cool.
My comment on this is this is not a game I played or anything, but I'll comment on the Mode 7 aspect a little bit. Because I actually find that, and this is something we talked about the other day, a charming aspect of the system, that this scaling and rotation of sprites was so heavily featured. And, to me, like, I actually kind of like, as a collector, going out and trying to find some of the more ridiculous Mode 7 games for the Super Nintendo. I find them awfully charming, and there's one by Vic Tokai in particular that is that basically is a flight simulator game, and I'm actually trying to... It's got some super generic name that's like hard to remember, so I'm actually like desperately... The research department is desperately trying to find that name for me as I kind of meander here. Jason, do you have any thoughts on either... Probably not the game, I guess, but just the Mode 7 on the Super Nintendo?
Yeah, so Mode 7 is used well in a couple games, but certainly is a little bit of a trope. I can understand where Patrick might be coming from on that. So how about we give you a game that I would consider quite good that features Mode 7. Okay. What are your thoughts on Mario Kart?
Ooh.
Pass.
Oh, the crowd boos. Boo.
Yeah, so I can say a little, very little bit about Mario Kart, I guess, because passing, I guess, completely wrecks the flow there. So I only played a little bit of Mario Kart at a friend's house. I was extremely anti-Mario, though, and never appreciated it. Finally, when I was playing Mario Kart 7, did I realize, oh yeah, this Mario Kart thing, it's actually pretty good. So on the Super Nintendo, all I could really think of at the time is how it was Mario, and that's so kiddie and all of that.
So Super Air Diver, aka Lock-On in the United States, that is the Vic Tokai flight sim that I was thinking of. That I actually bought it about a year or two ago. Patrick, you may have been with me in the Grid Snap studio when we were going kind of retro game shopping in the Bay Area. And I just really like those silly Mode 7 experiments. All right, so let's... go ahead, Patrick.
So I wanted to ask something real quick.
Oh, sure. That's not allowed. That's against the rules. Did you not listen? No, just kidding. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So since you indicate an appreciation for like those egregious uses of Mode 7, have you tried Super Adventure Island and witnessed the infamous Higgins Fall?
I have not witnessed this.
All right. Well, be sure to put that on your list to pick up, because the game itself is perfectly fine, but it starts off with Master Higgins falling through the clouds, and it's just one of the most ridiculous, egregious, completely irrelevant uses of Mode 7 that you will see on any Super Nintendo game
that
ever.
Sounds like Actraiser's, God coming from the sky down to Earth Mode 7.
In terms of the visual effect, sure, but in Actraiser, that actually seemed to fit, and I would say that was a random use of Mode 7 that worked.
All right, so here's another game, Wild Guns, Natsume, 1994.
Yep, that's actually a pretty fun game. You and I, we played it on the Switch version.
Indeed we did, yes.
Yep, so I would consider that to be one of the rare, worthwhile Super Nintendo games.
Rare, like I was about to say, honor defended, but I see we still have some work to do here.
Yeah. I am not going to let the defense of the SNES honor come that easily, but I really like the combination of the Wild West plus the cybernetic, not really cyberpunk, although it's kind of approaching that, but cybernetic motif. You have that combination. It's not steampunk, but it's a really cool mesh there.
All right, let's take another quick break. When we come back, more Super Nintendo with Patrick. Welcome back to the Grid Snaps podcast. Rob Howard here with Patrick and guest Jason, grilling him on the Super Nintendo. I think here's what we'll do. I'll fire one out, and then Jason, after we're done with that game, you can fire the next one out. All right, so what from the list shall I quiz you on? What about, okay, here's a game that is really more famous, I guess, for its cover art, Phalanx by Kemco, 1992.
Oh, yes, that's the one where the cover is of, like, the old man holding the banjo, I think.
That is right, yes.
Yep. So, not a big fan of the game. I always thought it was somewhat so-so. Now, the developer, I think, I'm trying to recall if that was developed by Kaneko. I'm not sure. I may be getting my developers mixed up. Maybe that was Kemco. But either way, the developer had made some decent games, just that wasn't one of them in particular that I cared for. And what I discovered years later is that it was actually a port of a game from the X68000 system. And the game moved more quickly, had more enemies, etc. on the X68000 version. So really, the SNES one was a gimped version of that game. Now, I won't say that the X68000 was a classic and the SNES ruined it or anything like that, but the original concept, it was a little faster paced, which makes sense seeing as the X68000 used a Motorola chip similar to what was used in the Genesis.
Real quick here, before we turn it over to Jason, the research department has told me the developers on that were Zoom Incorporated and Kemco, if the research department is to be believed. And there's also a Game Boy Advance version, so one wonders if that version on the Game Boy Advance plays more like the Sharp 68000 computer version did or not.
I probably wouldn't bet on that, but
yeah, it could just be a straight port of the Super Nintendo ROM. Yeah. But anyway, all right, so that's that one. Jason, you're up.
All right. So since there's at least a little bit of an undertone here of Genesis versus Super Nintendo, topic everybody loves, let's get into a controversial game that could, help settle the debate. How about Contra 3?
Oh no!
Oh wow! Oh wow! Contra 3, Contra 3, the Alien Wars. Yeah, held up as one of the pillars of the Super Nintendo superiority. Yeah. So, first of all, Contra 3 is a fine game in its own right. I would give it a very respectable 7. No, let's make that a 6 out of 10.
6 out of 10, respectable. Okay,
yes.
Please continue.
Now, the things that really, looking back historically, so there was Contra 3, and then the people who made Contra 3 went over to the Genesis as part of Treasure, and they made a game called Gunstar Heroes, which was about 100 times better than Contra 3 and really showed how much better they could make a game on the Genesis. So then Konami turned around and to show the traders at Treasure who had left their company, they made Contra Hardcore, which obliterated both Gunstar Heroes and Contra 3. So I would really say the best Contra is Hardcore on the Genesis. Now, if you want to talk about the second best Contra, then that would be Super C on the original Nintendo. And third best, but I will give Contra 3 this. It is maybe the fourth best Contra after Shattered Soldier on the PS2.
So I'm going to offer a dissenting opinion here.
Wait, is that in the rules?
It is, yes. It is absolutely in the rules.
Okay.
I am the Senate. So here's my take on this, and I have both games. Obviously, I did not play Hardcore when I was contemporary, or when it was released, I should say. I actually acquired it a couple years ago, the actual cart, not a ROM. Went out and bought it. It's still reasonably affordable, but it is a little tricky to find. And here's my thing. Okay, like, I totally respect the craft that went into Contra Hardcore. I mean, that's obvious with every pixel in that game. It is absolutely a showcase of the so-called blast processing, which just really is just a faster CPU. And all that. And so, this is not really to try to knock Contra Hardcore, but the point I would make about Contra 3 is I feel like it's its own, it's got a completely different difficulty curve. I had Contra 3. I was able to beat Contra 3. I can't imagine being able to, on the stock 3 lives and continue system of Hardcore without a Game Genie or something beating that game. It is balls to the wall difficult. And I think there's something to be said, and maybe it's because the Super Nintendo, even though it had a richer color palette than the Genesis, was frankly slower in the CPU department. Maybe those restrictions actually helped that game a little bit and gave it its own unique flavor. I guess that's my counterpoint.
Yeah, and that's a fair counterpoint because Contra 3 did have a difference in terms of the scenes. Like, for example, instead of fighting against giant dinosaurs against the backdrop of an awesome flowing waterfall, Contra 3 had scenes where you jumped from one rocket to the next, which, by the way, I actually like that scene. But I do get what you're saying, that maybe on the Super Nintendo, it was like Contra 3 is the Contra for babies, and then there's on the Genesis there's the real man's Contra. I get it, and that's a fair statement.
So I'll add one more thing on Contra 3, in that I think the worst stages on those are the ones where they utilize Mode 7.
The overhead ones, I think,
yes.
right?
Yes. I was being nice and not picking on those, but you are right. Those are the worst parts of the game.
All right, so let's look at another game here. So I'm going to pick one that I actually don't necessarily think you played, and if you just say pass, it's fine. But Choplifter 3.
Choplifter 3.
Yeah.
So I did not play that,
Right.
but what I want to say is that I was a huge fan of Choplifter. Mainly on the Atari 5200 is where I played it. I was a huge fan of the game. So if you have anything to say about Choplifter 3, let's hear it.
I absolutely do not. So let's move on very quickly then to Brawl Brothers.
Brawl Brothers, the sequel to Rival Turf, starring Uzi Nelson. So Brawl Brothers was actually not the worst game in the world. It was all right. It was a step up from Rival Turf, which was a pretty dull Final Fight clone. But yeah, Brawl Brothers, it was a decent game. I don't remember anything that was particularly noteworthy that screamed, "This is the power of the Super Nintendo." It just really seemed like a very standard beat 'em up to me.
Right. All right, and since you bring that up, I think this will be the last one we do before another break. I think this will give me an excuse to put a lot of cool SNES music in this podcast. So you mentioned specifically games that show the power of the system. So I'm thinking of a good one here that would do that. So let's talk about the legendary, the renowned, the game that makes people shudder in their footsteps, the game that will cause you, sir, to bend the knee, and that is Super Castlevania.
Oh, Super Castlevania 4. All right. So I want to start by dispelling a myth, okay? The common perception is that this is a remake of the NES game because it's about Simon Belmont. The NES game is about Simon Belmont. The problem there is that Konami released another Simon game 2 years later for the X68000. So if the Super Nintendo one was a remake, a bad remake, then the X68000 game was the ultimate remake where Konami fixed their mistakes. But that's all wrong. What's really going on is that each game, NES, Super Nintendo, and X68K, each one is really a retelling of the Belmont legend. Like in the old days before internet, when minstrels wandered the city streets and told their own versions of classic tales. That's what's going on there. Okay, so
I never thought of it that way.
Not a remake, does not replace the NES game, especially since the NES game is better. Okay, so saying that Super Castlevania 4 is a good Castlevania. So that's kind of like saying that paper straws work better than plastic and metal. Okay, they have their place, but everyone can tell it's an obvious lie. The game is way too garishly colored. It's got so much orange and brown, and the thing is, it's on a console that was actually good at colors. That is one thing that I will give the Super Nintendo, is that it had a nice color palette, and I'm not talking about necessarily the number of colors on screen and all of that, which was a plus for the Super Nintendo also. But just if you look at games in general, you will see that the base color palette was very well chosen. I would actually say better chosen than the base Genesis color palette. Super Castlevania 4 doesn't use that. It uses colors that clash with each other. You've got these bright greens and these bright oranges with brown all on the same screen. One of the bosses is a giant floating skull, normally a cool thing, except that it's orange. It's in a game that already has way too much orange. The music is really not good. It's sometimes referred to as the orchestral version of the Castlevania music. Well, number one, Castlevania music, while it can be done in an orchestral form, that's not what the Super Nintendo is doing. Okay. And some of the music, like in the cave level, is just outright bad. And the 8-way whipping, that could have been good. The thing is, the levels aren't designed to really need to use it. In the situations where you might get some benefit from the 8-way whipping, you can instead just do this thing where you let your whip dangle, and somehow by casually dangling your limp whip over the edge and just having it lay on top of an enemy, it continually hurts the enemy. It's just ridiculous to play through now, especially when there's something like Castlevania Bloodlines out there.
Yeah, let me just say, I think here, I don't really have a good counter on this one. I do think, now, I do wish Chris Miller was on here because he will defend Super Castlevania IV. There are many people that will defend it, actually. The VideoGameCritic.com website gives it an A- even, and sings its praises, and I know that guy's played everything, including the other Castlevania games you've said, but I actually do agree with you here. I feel like there was, what's interesting about Castlevania is that there was a couple of different, everyone now, especially if you grew up in the mid-1990s, late 1990s, you really are thinking about Igavanias when people talk about Castlevania. That's what's on people's head. Metroidvanias, the ones that Iga was responsible for or played a role in. And people forget that Castlevania had a couple different styles before it settled into the Metroidvania thing. I mean, you really had the first game, which is kind of like Super Castlevania IV, which is like a linear platforming experience, maybe with some secrets, some blocks you can whip or whatever. You had Simon's Quest, which had bizarre RPG elements, right? And we would see that happen later with Symphony of the Night and some of the Igavania games. RPG elements would kind of come back in. You had Castlevania 3 on the NES, which was kind of still in that linear style, but you had multiple characters. And really with Rondo of Blood or Dracula X, which, Patrick's absolutely right. That's an amazing game. You start to see the evolution of the series to what it became with Symphony of the Night, although I would argue that Castlevania or Dracula X is its own thing, apart from the Metroidvania style, where it's kind of linear but with lots of branching. And so really Castlevania was a little bit more experimental, and I sort of view, when I played this game recently, Super Castlevania IV, I'm so used to non-linear aspects and the RPG aspects that it's actually hard for me to play linear Castlevania now. I think that style is not as pleasant to go back to. So I have to agree with you there. Jason, do you have any takes on this game?
For me, this was a rental, and I did not enjoy that either. I much prefer the NES Castlevanias, and then also later, obviously, the Metroidvanias that came afterwards. So for me, this is one of the worst in the series. I mean, overall, it's a good series. This one would be not one I would recommend.
We're back on the Grid Snaps podcast, talking the Super Nintendo, quizzing and grilling Patrick, because Patrick is encyclopedic about games, except when he says pass. But that's okay. We don't expect him to have played everything, right? You did not play Shaq Fu, which I'm a little disappointed. I have to say, a little disappointed that you did not play the legendary Shaq Fu. But instead of dwelling on that disappointment, let's look at our list again. Okay, so here's one that you may pass on, but I have to ask. Strike Gunner STG by VAP.
Pass.
All right, that's too bad. It's super obscure. I'm just looking at this list. Okay, Sunset Riders, Konami, 1993.
Yep, Sunset Riders. So that was a pretty good game. I enjoyed it in the arcade also. So that it was really one of those things that felt like an oddball, because at least here in the US, I don't know how it was in Japan, but the arcade game felt pretty obscure. But I had played it, and so I was glad to see it get a home version, which I played. And what I learned was that it was actually also ported to the Genesis, but for whatever reason, I didn't know that at the time, so I only played it at a friend's house on the Super Nintendo. So yeah, I enjoyed that one.
And what about, I'll ask this, then Jason, you can fire away here, the Bomberman games. I'll just say the Bomberman games, since there were several on the Super Nintendo.
Yeah, I did not play the Super Nintendo ones. I only played those back then on the TurboGrafx.
All right, Jason.
Okay, so basically, I think the SNES library has two big strengths. That would be RPGs and first-party titles. So let's do an RPG here. Chrono Trigger.
Oh yeah, Chrono Trigger. Yeah. So I would say that it's a hugely overrated, pretty poor game. I did not like it.
Right as
No, God, please, no, no.
Yeah, I mean,
No!
I'm sorry. I probably should have asked before. Did either of you like that game? Because I couldn't really imagine that. But
Now, I'll say, go ahead, Jason. You go ahead.
I've played through it multiple times, and I do love it.
All right, so at this point, I'll act. We're going to have a little side debate here. This is exactly what I wanted to have happen, by the way. This is great. So I'm going to go ahead and throw the flag on the field here, separate Jason and Patrick, and into. I guess it won't. We can't say a penalty box. You're not being penalized, but now we have. Because here's the thing: I mentioned before that I actually missed out on a lot of really big games on the Super Nintendo, and Chrono Trigger was one of them, actually. A lot of the RPGs I missed out on. So I only know Chrono Trigger from its reputation after the fact. And so what I want you to do now is, Patrick, explain why you think it's a bad game, and then I want Jason to counter. Go.
Oh, okay. Well, I actually don't have a lot here that I can say because I played it so many years ago and just remember not liking it. So yeah, I'm going to have a hard time here really defending my position. Yeah, I picked it up and played it and was just kind of like, yeah, this is not impressing me. And it may have been a case where it had so much build up that it just didn't live up to the hype, but I could not get into it.
Okay. Well, that's fair enough. I'll tell you some of the reasons that I love it. The music is brilliant. Some of the best music on the SNES. Very unconventional in some ways, but also very memorable. I really enjoyed the story as a kid. I've played it a few times, so I can't view it without nostalgic glasses. So I'm not sure if it will hold up for everybody if you are just brand new to it or not. But I think there's a good variety of characters. They tug on your heartstrings a little bit, or you actually are invested in the characters. It's pretty slick how they do the time travel. Then there's a new game plus as well, which was a pretty unique feature at the time. There's some really cool scenes that are sort of set pieces, I guess you could say. There's like a racing scene in an apocalyptic future, which you don't see that in many JRPGs. There's the really cool idea of where you actually get put on trial, and it takes things you did during the game that you had no idea would matter while you're at the festival, and like replays what you did in those scenes. And it can, if you, like the tropes, like if you take something without asking, which is normally okay in JRPGs, it can come back to bite you. Or when you run into these are spoilers, sorry for people that are 30 years late to the party. But like right. When you run into Marl at the beginning of the game, if you go to pick up, if you do something before you go straight to her, then that shows that you didn't care or you weren't apologetic or something. Or if you there's a scene where you're like waiting on her to do something, and if you try to move before she gets done, then they zing you for that. It's just some neat stuff like that. And there's a pretty cool battle system as well with some of the how do you want to say it? Like there's special moves based on who's in your party. So there's like two characters, if you have them in your party, they can do a combined move. Or if you have a three characters active at a time game. So if you've got specifically three characters, they can do a special move together. Things like that.
Wow, you almost make me think that I should play the game again.
No, that sounds, and actually I was thinking the same thing until you spoiled it. Just kidding. No, I think, wow, I have to, there's certainly, I have weird gaps in my gaming history where, like, there was a gap sort of in the late 90s, which made me miss out on, like, the Dreamcast stuff and even certain PS2 era things that were early, because I was, as Jason knows, we were in school together in music college, so I wasn't gaming as much. And with the Super Nintendo, as I already mentioned, there's the thing where I couldn't trade games as easily. But then also I was getting into computers a little bit, so I was starting to, like, play things like Wolfenstein and Doom, which of course was on the Super Nintendo, but not in a very good way. It is not a system. That's not a game I'll use to defend the system's honor, for sure. And so, there's just a lot of these games where some of them I've played, like Final Fantasy VI, aka 3. I've played that one. In fact, let's talk about that. I want to make sure as we get into the 45-minute mark here that we try to hit some of the more famous games as well. So, Patrick, just the Final Fantasy games on the Super Nintendo, what did you think of those?
Yep. So I did not play Final Fantasy 3/6. I did play Final Fantasies 2/4, which is actually part of the reason I never played the other one. So I did not enjoy Final Fantasy 2. My memories about that one are a little bit clearer than they are for Chrono Trigger, because I did give Final Fantasy IV another shot years later when it was released on the PlayStation. And really, what I didn't like about it is the story. It felt like a mess because the main character was just really wishy-washy and unlikable. And so I couldn't get into uh, this plot, which involves a lot of sacrifices and self-sacrifices for his benefit. And it just makes it, I couldn't get into that because it's like, this guy is a wuss. He's terrible. Why would other people be giving up their lives for him? The other thing is, it really got really confusing at times, and that might be because when I was given the option, I renamed the main character to Golbez, which is the villain's name. So that may have helped add to confusion, but I don't think that can be responsible for all of it.
Right. I'll say that my experience with the games all played later, of course, is that I played Final Fantasy on the American Nintendo Final Fantasy and thought it was awesome. And actually, I'll comment, that game holds up better than you think it will. Its simplicity is actually kind of refreshing. But fast forward in the future, I don't recall if I played 4, but I did play 5, which never came out, originally, right, for the Super Nintendo in America. That one has, of course, the job system, which is really, really addicting and really hits you in that oxytocin center of your brain, because it's just like getting your characters trained up to do the jobs. But that's a game that wasn't available at all in America originally. Final Fantasy 6/3, though, I remember when I played that, for the first time, I want to say that it was probably on an emulator when I was in college with you, Jason, and I remember just being blown away by it. Even by that time, technology had advanced quite a bit and everything, and it just seemed like so far ahead of its time in terms of its storytelling and the way it just kind of effortlessly went from different characters back and forth to set the stage. How it had like kind of some cool mystery, and also that was really, I think, when the kind of steampunk aspect of Final Fantasy really, I think, really kind of matured, right? Where you had the mecha, but still had these elements of, a fantasy world. And of course, the music in 6. Now, there's many, the music in Final Fantasy is so good across the board that it's hard to say that's the best music. But the music from 6 is some of the most memorable. And then when I played it, much more, because whenever you play a game on an emulator, you don't play it very seriously. You kind of dabble in it and just let it go. I at least that's what I do. I just can't. There's something about that experience that I don't play it seriously. So when it came out later, I bought the PlayStation 1, which is a little unfortunate. Patrick probably knows why. They made a Final Fantasy compilation for the PlayStation 1. I still own this. right? And it was Final Fantasy VI, and I want to say, was it 6 and 4? I can't remember what the other game was.
No, it was 5 and 6.
5 and 6.
Number 4 came with Chrono Trigger, but I didn't even try that version.
All right. The reason why I say it's unfortunate is even though, yes, the game is playable, it looks good, all that, blah, 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 they did include, I think, some unfortunate kind of early CG cutscenes that are just kind of like, eh. I mean, it doesn't really ruin the game or anything, but like it's just kind of like, eh. So I would not actually recommend that unless, if you found it cheap somewhere and you can play a PS1 disc, whatever, right? But like it's, so that's the version I've played the most. And yeah, man, it's just classic, amazing RPG. It's actually also one of my wife's favorite games, so by default, it has to be one of my favorite games too, right? So, so Jason, do you have any memories of Final Fantasy VI?
Yeah, I mean, this was definitely one of my other favorites on the system. I totally agree with you on the PlayStation remake, which I have as well. The CG stuff doesn't hold up anymore. So just play it on Super Nintendo. It is great. If you didn't like 4, I think you'll still like this. It's just it's such a much bigger game. The story's more interesting. There's more characters, a lot deeper in terms of your battle system and abilities and things like that. I liked 4 too, but this Final Fantasy VI just has more charm. You mentioned the music. Uematsu, it's just one of the masterpieces, of gaming, really. So, highly recommend.
Right. And by the way, since you mentioned composers, I will say that the Super Nintendo really did. Look, here's the thing. Like, because I know I'm going to get some jimmies rustled here by saying this, but like, obviously, the Genesis had some great music, right? Amazing music. But I think when you analyze the capabilities, the FM synthesis chip that the Genesis had versus the wavetable sampling that the Super Nintendo had, completely different flavors of music. I think for rock music, funky stuff, which again, this just fits the theme of the Genesis for being a great action game, arcade game type system. That music was better on the Genesis in a lot of ways. You look at like the Streets of Rage soundtrack, of course that's amazing, and of course, that composer, absolutely phenomenal.
Yuzo Koshiro.
Yes, thank you. I was going to have I was blanking on that, and I was going to have the research department find Yuzo Koshiro for me. But on the Super Nintendo, orchestral soundtracks, and in my opinion, these soundtracks sound just as good now because I just love the sound of that wavetable synthesis of these sampled instruments. Yes, they're crunchy, and they're not, this is not, the way they can do game soundtracks now, where either it's a real orchestra or they use the sampling now is so high quality that you can barely tell that it's sampled now. But Yuzo Koshiro's orchestral score for Actraiser is one of the all-time great game scores of all time, and really, to me, it's like very few game scores make me as emotional and hit me in the feels like Actraiser does. Patrick, I think you had a thought.
So talking about Actraiser's music, so whether it's the original Super Nintendo game soundtrack or whether it's one of the arranged CDs, etc., great, sincere respect for Koshiro. And the only song I like in Actraiser is the Fillmore song, which is the most fastest-paced action gamey type song in there. All of the orchestral songs really didn't do anything at all for me in that game.
I think I can just feel there's like a respect bar that's like, and which is okay because your respect bar for me probably is decreased when I defended the likes of Contra III. Likewise, my respect bar for you now is shrinking as I hear you disparage one of my all-time favorite soundtracks. Right?
Yeah, I was trying to be very respectable and not say like the truth about the soundtrack. So.
Oh goodness! So let's hit up. Here's what I want to do now. This has been a lot of fun. I think what I'd like to do is I want to hit up a few more of the famous games. We'll take a really fast final break. Then we'll do a lightning round, and we'll alternate. I'll do one, then Jason does one. I'll do one, Jason does one, until we decide we're sick and tired of this and want to stab each other with ice picks. All right, so but before we take the break, let's talk about the first party stuff. So let's just lump all of this in. So Zelda, Mario, Yoshi's Island, because this may surprise our listeners, Patrick's experiences with these games. The Nintendo first party, go.
All right, well, the first one you mentioned was Zelda, so let's talk about Zelda 3, okay? All right. So, big, huge release at the time. I mean, Zelda and Zelda 2 on the NES were just bonkers, all right. And so now you've got Zelda 3, hugely anticipated release. Right. And if you recall, when that game starts, there's rain. Do you remember the rain?
Yes, I do, yes.
Yeah. Oh, all right. I remember the rain, too, and revisiting the rain, it's really piddly and not very impressive. If you look at something like Streets of Rage 2 on the Genesis, during one of the fights, it's raining. Now that is some awesome 16-bit rain, not Zelda.
Holy cow, ladies and gentlemen!
It's true. Pull up Streets of Rage 2 and look at that rain, and then look at Zelda.
Just think about this. It's not so much that you may be right, you may be wrong. I don't know. Right, but the fact that that's what you choose to focus on.
Well, no, that's how the game begins. That's its initial impression. So anyway, Zelda 3 is basically the adventures of Fat Link as he goes around doing circular spin attacks on shrubbery. I mean, compare that to Hyrule Warriors, where you do a spin attack through moblin flesh. Yeah, in Zelda 3, you're like walking around, cutting down shrubbery. And even just the layout of the adventure. So they're the dungeons, which I'll give some credit to the dungeons. Those are good. But to get to the dungeons, the overworld is just ridiculous. Where to get from point A to B, of course, it's not going to be a straight line, but it's the most absurd roundabout way where they're like knee-high fences and just all of these things. It's really just way too cumbersome and not entertaining to get from one dungeon to the next in the overworld, which is definitely a downgrade from the original Zelda, where the overworld was like its own immensely explorable, entertaining place full of legitimate secrets, not just cut down all the shrubs.
I'm astonished. Yeah, this is an astonishing take, ladies and gentlemen.
I mean, and I mean, if I recall, and it's been a while, but I mean, even the music wasn't very good. It's none of that stuck with me. I mean, and I'm one of those people who on the original Zelda would just let it sit at the title screen and just listen there and be
Patrick,
like,
they're the same.
This they're music
like
is so good.
The compositions are in the same style and mode of the originals. How can you not like that music? I find a lot of this take astounding, but like the music, I'll just focus on that. Like it's in the same style. I mean, one thing about Koji Kondo is that he composes in the same bag. Like if you listen to his Mario Brothers music, it's the happy ragtimey stuff, and you can instantly recognize that it's Koji Kondo. And the same thing with his Zelda music. It's kind of, I guess you would call it early 20th century serial style adventure music. I'm astonished that you take such a dim view of the music.
Well, it's probably just because the Super Nintendo sound chip really wasn't up to the task of handling that style of music.
Ooh, boy.
That's probably the issue there.
All right. So, Jason, go ahead. I know you're chomping at the bit here.
Right. So, I'll deal with the music part first. So, I will have to disagree with you on that one. I think the music is great. If I can throw you a lifeline, perhaps. I mean, it is orchestral, and this was kind of the first attempt at playing orchestral music. You know, it's obviously not up to like wave quality that we're used to today, but the music itself, I think, still stands pretty strong. And the game itself is one of my favorite games ever. So I would strongly disagree there.
Respect bar going low.
Right. I find that the overworld is actually quite interesting and very explorable. And of course, the dungeons are great. There's not much of a story, but that's not what the game's about. It's just a fun adventure with your typical Zelda puzzles and things like that. But I just think executed probably, better than at any other point in the series.
And with narrative, I'll say this: Zelda does something really cool with its narrative that I think a lot of games don't do or don't do very well, and that's they give you. I think sometimes like people think a game narrative has to be like really spoon-fed, like you're just given story beats and it's just inescapable what the story is. I think sometimes it's just as effective to kind of give little breadcrumbs and allow the player to fill in the gap with their mind. I think that can be extremely effective. Because then you're not dealing with, keep having to keep things like really consistent and straight because you got all these story beats you're juggling, and I think the Zelda games actually do a really good job of this because you have really cool character vignettes. And what I remember from Link to the Past was you had that really cool bit with the guy that played the flute in the Dark World, right? I'm sure Jason will remember that. That's just a wonderful character vignette, and actually a lot of Zelda games do this. In Twilight Princess, there's an amazing vignette with one of the mini-bosses. That's really one of my favorite narrative things, little tricks in any game, is what they did with the mini-boss in Twilight Princess. So it's kind of, you see that beginning in Link to the Past with the Dark World stuff, and yeah, I agree with you, Jason. I think it's interesting, Patrick, what you brought up about the knee-high fences. I that is a level design faux pas that I actually teach against doing, which is having an obstacle that visually looks like you can easily get around it, but you can't. I've just never really considered that in a 2D game like that, though, because it doesn't look realistic, or nearly as realistic as a 3D modern game. I just never considered that to be a big deal before. But I do want to at least give you a little credit that that's not a unfounded criticism to have of a game's level design. But I can't say that times I've played that game, which of course came later on the Game Boy Advance, I never thought the world was more or less restricted than any other Zelda game. I guess I will say that Skyward Sword definitely had this element of like, okay, this is too much work to get the dungeon to dungeon. The whole game's kind of a dungeon, and I don't like that. But I didn't feel that way about Link to the Past at all. So before we run out of time, before the lightning round, let's talk about the Mario games. Any takes on those, Patrick, that will shock and disturb us all?
Yeah, I didn't really play the Mario games because they were so slow by comparison to the blast speed of Sonic the Hedgehog. So, I mean, I watched them and was kind of like, slow.
All right, so we're going to take a quick break before Patrick can jump in and say that actually the true classic of this era was Barkley's Shut Up and Jam. And when we come back, we're going to do a lightning round on the Super Nintendo in just a moment. So, Patrick, I've been searching for the Grid Snaps podcast on iTunes, and I just can't seem to find it. I get cooking podcasts, I get UFO podcasts, I get true crime podcasts. They're not even called Grid Snaps. I search for video games. I get about 1,000 video game podcasts, but not ours. Why in the world is this happening?
Well, Rob, I think that's because the Grid Snaps podcast doesn't have enough positive reviews.
Why would positive reviews matter? You mean like 5-star reviews on the App Store?
Absolutely. There's an algorithm that actually looks at the number of positive reviews and determines the podcast placement based on that.
Wow, so basically if you go into your podcasting app on your Apple iPhone or iPod or iPad, leave a 5-star review, you're actually doing us a real service.
Absolutely. It's almost better than cash money.
I mean, I'll take both. Definitely will take both. But a 5-star review on iTunes or Google Play or Podbean or any of the other outlets that you can find us on in which there is a review mechanism is going to actually greatly boost our listenership, which would be really, really awesome because we want people to listen to us, right? I mean, that is kind of the whole point of it, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. The more people who hear us, the cooler it is.
All right, so yeah, please leave us a 5-star review on iTunes or wherever else you're listening to this. So yeah, please do that, please. All right, and we're back on the Grid Snaps podcast. This has been really fun, very entertaining. I hope very surprising, because you're getting some non-orthodox, some heterodox, if you will, opinions from Patrick on some classics, which is, by the way, one of the reasons why we're doing this. So we're going to do a lightning round now to close things out. So I'm going to do a game, and then Patrick will give a brief description or pass, and then Jason, and we'll just go back and forth until we get tired of it. Okay, here we go. Alien 3.
Pass.
Super EDF.
Oh, yes. Earth Defense Force.
Yeah.
Mediocre shooter.
Okay. Awesome Possum.
Pass.
Illusion of Gaia.
That was actually an interesting RPG-ish type game. Big fan of Quintet, actually. They made several good Super Nintendo games. One of the few developers, actually, who could really pull that off.
Thunder Spirits.
Thunder Spirits. Port of the Thunder Force arcade game, which was itself a port of Thunder Force 3 from the Genesis. The problems being that the arcade game was worse than the Genesis version because it had no stage select, and the Super Nintendo version is even worse because it's loaded with flicker, slowdown, and worse music.
All right, Jason.
Final Fight.
Yeah. Final Fight. Great arcade game. I have huge respect for the arcade game. The Super Nintendo version, with its maximum of 3 enemies on screen and lack of 2 players simultaneous, was not good. The only plus there is at least you could play as Hager, who is a hero among men.
Super Double Dragon.
Pass.
Secret of Mana.
It was okay. I played some of it. Wasn't really enamored of it. Certainly didn't seem bad though.
Zardion.
Zardion. Now that's a game that I really wanted to like because it had that awesome mech, red and silver mech on the cover, and it was just a mediocre side-scrolling platformer.
Mario's Time Machine.
Pass.
Full Throttle All-American Racing.
Pass.
Adventures of Batman and Robin.
So I actually did not play the Super Nintendo version, so maybe you can tell me this, but on the Genesis and the Sega CD, it was basically a graphical powerhouse.
Yes, graphically it was better. I don't think the Super Nintendo version had any of the cutscenes, or if they were greatly pared down.
Okay, it's interesting, yeah, because I remember it being very, very well liked on the Super Nintendo for sure. Okay, so next game, Actraiser.
So Actraiser is the fusion of a simplistic strategy game plus a mediocre hack and slash, and that adds up to an inspired classic that felt unlike anything else on the Super Nintendo. I already mentioned also how I love the Fillmore music, but I also, setting music aside, I loved the temple level. That's one of my favorite, that kind of Egyptian-ish temple design is something that I always like in video games. For example, love Serious Sam because of that. And I think Actraiser pulls off one of the best temple levels in 16-bit games.
Is Hagane worth $2 or $300?
I'd say it's worth $2. So it's a cool concept, but it is pretty janky in terms of the hit detection, especially. And unfortunately, I sold it for I think like $3 on eBay, and then a year later it was worth $100, and now it's up to like $300.
All right, so we're going to close things out by doing one last thing here. So that was the lightning round. What I'd like to do now is I would like every member of the panel to select their all-time favorite Super Nintendo game. All right, their favorite game that they think no one else knows about. All right, and their guilty pleasure game. All right, I know I'm asking a lot here. All right, so again, all-time favorite game, obscure game. All right, that that you think people generally don't know about, and finally your guilty pleasure game. I'll start to give people time to think. So my all-time favorite game is Actraiser. That should be clear by this conversation. All right. So I would say my obscure game, to the extent that I have any knowledge of obscure Super Nintendo games, I would have to say a weird, very odd RPG named Draken. I wouldn't say to run out and get it, but I just found it really interesting from a technological perspective. And then finally, which is almost like a guilty pleasure game, but I'll say for that, I did play the crap out of the original Final Fight. I understood why it was inferior even at that time to the arcade version, but I still really greatly enjoyed it. Okay, Jason, why don't you go favorite, obscure, and guilty pleasure?
Okay, favorite. There's a lot to choose from, but I'm gonna probably have to go with Link to the Past. Sorry, Pat. And then obscure game, Dino City.
Okay, all right.
And then guilty pleasure, huh?
That's right. Yeah.
I don't know that I feel guilty about any of the Super Nintendo games that I like.
I guess according to Patrick, you'd be guilty about A Link to the Past.
Right. I don't think that counts for most. How about Bubsy? Which
all right, Bubsy. All right. All right, Patrick.
Okay. So first, the all-time fave. I'm going to cheat just a little bit. I'm picking a Japanese Super Famicom game, and that would be Umihara Kawase. Which is basically about this girl with a fishing rod, and she uses it to swing around from one platform to another, kind of like Bionic Commando, but actually quite a bit better. The one that no one else knows about, and for this I'm picking one that actually did come out in the US, so it's obscure but obtainable, is Kendo Rage. Where you play as a schoolgirl who is magically transformed into a skimpy fighting outfit with a sword, going around in just the most bizarre levels. It's similar to the Valis games or Legendary Axe on the TurboGrafx. And then for the guilty pleasure, I would probably say Mecha Robot Golf. It's a golf game where you see a robot on the cover, and when you start playing this golf game, you get to pick from your characters who are all extremely normal people. You don't get to play as the robot, so it's basically a standard golf game, except every now and then when you reach the end, you're pitted against the robot, who is just ridiculously powerful and making these enormous swings and everything like that. Now, when you play in partners mode, you can pick the robot to be your partner. So you aren't special, but you pick the robot to be your partner thinking, we're going to destroy all the other pairs. And the first words out of the robot's mouth, let's play fair. Words that I never once heard when that silvery steel goofball was my opponent. So, yeah, that's my guilty pleasure game because it's just so funny.
Right. So let's do some closing thoughts now. So my closing thought, I'll go first here, is there is one game I did forget to mention that I'll mention because it is actually one of my all-time favorites too, so I'll use my closing thoughts to mention it. Super Smash TV. I played that game so religiously, I actually sent a high score in to Nintendo Power for it. I don't know if they published it or not, but I was never really a high score chaser as a player sort of subtype, if you will. So that was really extraordinary for me, that I played the game enough to feel like my high score is worth something. That game absolutely has almost no slowdown at all, yet it has tons of enemies on the screen. The programmers working for Acclaim that were porting that game really deserve a lot of credit. It was an amazing port of the arcade title. They also made a vastly inferior version for the regular 8-bit Nintendo as well, but that 16-bit Super Nintendo Smash TV is really the definitive home version of that game, at least released at that time, and just astoundingly fun. And I guess my final closing thought is I really appreciated, to me, the Super Nintendo, what it did so well was it actually did, and maybe it was because of the limits of its technology, but I always felt like it established what home video gaming was, because it was still a time when a console was expected to copy the arcade. And because, the CPU speed, maybe Nintendo was more focused on a distinctly home experience, things that were slower paced, things that didn't rely on the quarter to kind of keep things moving along. And I think that progressed game design, and I've always really appreciated the Super Nintendo for that. So, Jason, your thoughts, and then Patrick can close it out, since this is kind of his show today. So, Jason, your thoughts.
Right. Well, like I said, the first-party titles are overall just really good. Super Mario World's one of my favorite platformers ever. Mario Kart was great and launched a great series. Star Fox is another one that I really enjoyed. Obviously, the frame rate is terrible, but, if you imagine your 12-year-old self, it was pretty amazing at the time.
Oh, yes.
And, of course, JRPGs, you really can't beat the Super Nintendo when it comes to that. So, like, in the age of emulation, RPGs hold up really well because you don't have to worry about all that input lag like you do on the action title. So they hold up well over time. In that regard, I'm still a Genesis fan overall, with, I think, a deeper library when it comes to things like beat 'em ups and action platformers and obviously sports games. But Super Nintendo was still a great system, and you can get a lot of hours in if you got both of them.
You cut off there, Jason, when you said you can get a lot of hours in, so you can just repeat that thought.
Just saying, you can get a lot of hours in if you have both of those systems. They complement each other well, just with the deep libraries that are a little bit different.
All right, and Patrick, your closing thoughts. Hopefully, we won't get trolled too hard here. But
So the first thing is that I'm actually thinking that I should revisit Chrono Trigger, because it's literally been 25 years since I played that, and I never tried any of the ports of it, either on PlayStation or DS, etc. So I'm thinking maybe I should give that one another chance and not let my reason-crippling Sega bias get in the way there. Now, outside of Chrono Trigger, though, like I said, I had bought up pretty much everything that I could from Funko Land and played through and got rid of all of them except for Super Mario World, which I'm only hanging on to because it's the pack-in version, and I want to sell it off with the system itself. But I don't do that because I do have probably like 15 or so of the Japanese games, and there are some fun Japanese Super Famicom games, like the Falcom games, Pop Full Mail, Brandish 2 Hard Mode, that I do enjoy. It's just such a shame that the publishers back in the day instead really focused on bringing out games that made the Genesis look good.
All right. But you do bring up an interesting point, the import scene, the things that were available in Japan, a little bit different. And if you get something like I have a Retron 5, so you can apply a translation patch to those cartridges if they exist, which I got to imagine for some of those they may exist. I don't know if you're knowledgeable of that, Patrick, if there's translation patches on some of those.
Oh, yeah, there definitely are. And speaking of translation patches, one game that really benefited from it was Seiken Densetsu 3, which is the sequel to Secret of Mana, and in my opinion is not only a much better game, but is an actually really good game. Does have a critical flaw, though, which is when bosses are doing their attacks, which is frequent, you can't move. It like stops the action, and it's frequent enough that it's annoying. But it looks like the upcoming Switch remake is not going to have that issue. So I'm actually looking forward to that.
A couple things I'll mention real quick to close out, and thank you for your time. This is one of the longer podcasts we've done, which is not surprising because it's a pretty big topic. But I'll just say that apropos to almost nothing, the research department, just as a side note, let me know that there's actually a recently released version of Double Dragon for the Super Nintendo where they took the Japanese Super Double Dragon and ported it over, and I guess it's supposed to be significantly superior to the United States Super Double Dragon, and that's like something you could still easily find on eBay and stuff, so it's just kind of interesting. And one more thing I do want to mention, there's an RPG that did not get brought up, and I wanted to bring it up because it's really special to me, and that's Earthbound, aka Mother 3. And the thing about... I'm actually now blanking. Was it Mother 2 or Mother 3? I can't remember which one in that series Earthbound was.
It was 2. It was Mother 2.
Mother 2, that's right. Mother 3 is the one they did not release, and I actually have a GBA card and a translation patch of. That's right. Mother 3 is that one. Mother 2 is Earthbound. So the reason I wanted to bring that up is I did not, of course, play that when I had the Super Nintendo because, like most kids probably at that time, I looked at this thing and I was like, what in the heck is this? With the weird marketing, with the scratch and sniff stuff in the magazine and all that. It just was like, well, this is weird, whatever. Well, I went and got it, and, it's the only game that my oldest daughter and I played from front to back together, and she played the crap out of it. She over-leveled my party because at the age she was at the time, this is like 5 or 6 years ago, she was old enough, to read and play an RPG like that, but she hadn't been completely ruined by like mobile garbage, at this point, right? So like she just overpowered my party because she would just play the same battles over and over again. So we had like infinite money and were super powerful, but we played through that entire game together. And it was a really cool kind of father-daughter experience. So, and there was just something about that game and how it takes place in America with like regular kids that just really connected with my daughter that like the fantasy games like Final Fantasy and all that just did not do when I would try to introduce her to those. There's something really special about Earthbound that makes people just a little bit crazy about it, and I'm in that realm there. So thank you, Nintendo. Thank you thank you for the late Satoru Iwata for helping fix that game. I think he came on and helped it come out, so that was certainly a special experience for me, even though it wasn't when the Super Nintendo was out. So okay, I think we're good to go. So thank you for listening, and stay on the grid and keep well hid.